threat modeling suite. They can actually create the issue, find the issues, find the pieces of vulnerable code prior to the development cycle, prior to the patching cycle, and introduce these type of stories within the development process that help. For all of you who raised your hand in here who are your helpers, your security professionals who are helping the development process, you tend to be witnesses within Agile. If you are invited to the daily Scrum meetings, congratulations. Most of the organizations I speak to, and every single one I've ever run, not the case. Now granted, I've been mostly at startups. I know a lot of larger enterprises have security teams that are outside the development organization. They try to help as much as they can, but they tend to become witnesses. They are not there for the day-to-day Scrum meetings. They don't necessarily get to participate in the design because they are chickens. They are not fully vested in the process. Does anybody know what chickens and pigs are, right? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So in the beginning of Schwaber's book is a very interesting parable about chickens and pigs. And the chicken asked the pig to open a restaurant. And I'm paraphrasing here. It's probably a little more funnier story than I'm going to tell it. But anyway, the chicken and the pig are walking along one day. They're good friends. Say, hey, let's open a restaurant together. We'll serve bacon and eggs for breakfast. It'll be a big hit. Everybody will love it. And the pig says, not on your life. Chicken says, why? He says, well, you know, you're a participant, but I'm fully invested. So when I say witness, you know, the chickens are the people we want to get out of the Agile process because we don't want them having any undue influence. The problem is that security professionals get lumped into that as well. The product manager sometimes is lumped into that as well, that their entire job is to get from sales, from marketing, from product marketing management and other avenues, all of the features, to make sense of them, prioritize them, and then schedule. So the security professionals, especially in the larger enterprises that I speak with, they tend to be on the outside looking in. They don't have influence on a lot of the day-to-day stuff. They're actually not actually reviewing some of the test cases and so forth. So this is just one of those weird little byproducts about Agile that comes up. And once again, I've gone through some of this already. I mean, there are a lot of types of security testing that have to be done systemically. We can do some types of penetration tests on a modular basis, unit basis, but by and large it's systemic. So that means you've got to have the complete piece of code up and running. And that's not going to fit in the sprint. You might test the previous one or the previous one, but you're not testing the current one. You're not doing, if it's taken, as I said, 10 to 15 working days to do your fuzzing testing, not fitting in the sprint. I mean, really, and that's one of the things where we've seen that if we see the application of Agile on projects like web application projects, because we are constantly turning that code, we're in a perpetual beta cycle, it works pretty well. But what falls by the wayside are some of the longer process investigative security. I mean, you can check the new pieces of security for white box testing. You can do some automated white box testing, that fits great. Black box testing, not so much. Non-repudiation testing, that's systemic. If you're talking about the entire logic flow of the application itself. So we squeeze things down to get them efficient and fast turnaround. We also squeeze out some of the testing we would normally do. So what to do about that? Part of my recommendation, create stories for attacks. Try to get as much as you actually can on the task cards. Assessment's not a 4-hour task, but see what you can do to fit that in. You want to be able to build your nightly builds and some of your test environments for your daily test to try to make up for some of the ground for the systemic stuff that you normally should be doing. Code dependencies and trust relationships. I'm not sure I really have a good one for that. And that's usually part of the threat modeling that I would conduct with any software application. And then design and coding subbed in within the same sprint. I strongly recommend that you remove the two. I'm gonna back up for one sec because I'm probably using some terms that may not be entirely clear. So for me, I differentiate between an architect, between a software designer, between a developer and a quality assurance person. The architect and the architecture phase is where I find all of the big business components that I need. I'm going to define what they do. I'm going to define the communication protocols between them, and I'm going to have a rough idea of what each and every single function that they're going to perform. At that point in time, I'm going to move into the design phase. And I'm going to get about halfway through the design phase. I might choose, this is going to be a Pojo-based application or a Struts application, or it's going to be Ruby, whatever. I know more or less the tools that I'm going to want to use to build. And then somewhere during that design phase, I'm actually going to go in and do my threat modeling, because I've coalesced enough of the business objectives to understand what I need to be worried about, and I've got some of the design principles in place that are going to affect the security of the system, but I've got enough there that I at least can do the threat modeling. I can look for non-repudiation types of attacks or timing attacks, or, well, maybe not timing attacks, but some of the other issues that I'm going to be working for. Oh, and by the way, if you can't tell, I'm a fan of Stride, so. So processes to help people. And people are brilliant at freaking breaking process. They just are. Developers are paid to build. And if there was one thing that I had to agree with on Chensi, is that the mindset's wrong. It's harder to train developers on security because they're used to building things. They're looking at ways to be creative to get something built. They want things to function. We can do the big happy dance when the first time our build goes through and it tests as unit test. Destroying stuff doesn't necessarily come naturally. And unless you've worked with a professional threat modeler or pen tester and you've seen how they can twist your application inside out with a few hours of time, unless you have actually seen that, I don't think a lot of developers really appreciate what it means to go through these processes and watch your code just get annihilated because you made some little stupid mistake. I wrote what I thought was the perfect key generation algorithm 12 years ago. And the next morning, the guy came in and said I broke it. He says, you were too perfect. You generate keys, and it's exactly 2 milliseconds for every digit within the key length. And so I knew exactly how long the key was, and I could break it in real time through brute forcing because I didn't have to go through the entire number sequence. So, you just don't find stuff like that. Probably my biggest problem with Agile is the product manager. I'm not talking about the product marketing manager. I'm not talking about the Scrum manager. I'm talking about the product manager. So if I'm running a waterfall development process, I'm probably going to hire a third party to come in and do either white box code review, probably more likely threat modeling. But if I'm going to run an Agile process, the first person I send to security awareness training is the product manager. Why? Because he's the one that's responsible for onboarding. He's the one that's going to get the stuff actually worked on. Because what we see today is that critical vulnerabilities get worked on if they're known. And as they are discovered, they get pushed onto the top of the pile and they get worked on. But the product manager is under incredible pressure from executives, from marketing, from sales. And I don't know about many of you have been in those sales meetings where the must-have feature, we can't make our quarter numbers unless we have this feature and we have it right now. And it turns out to be a lie most of the times anyway. But the product manager is the one that bears this responsibility. So what happens? High priority bugs in many cases, and medium priority bugs in almost every single case get chucked. And they fall into what I call the bucket. And I'm glad Microsoft and some others have started calling it the bucket too, because that's where security features that are not of a critical nature go to die. And they never get brought back in. How many of you have ever seen an output of Skybox? You guys know what Skybox is? So it's a network assessment tool. What you do is you basically draw out your network diagram. You put all the routers, switches, everything, servers you got in there, put in the versions of the firmware and the software, and it will map every single threat vector you have. Because it has a database of known attacks, and so it will show you what people can do to get in, how critical it is, and what sort of data they can access or get out, or what they can manipulate. And it's a beautiful representation, a visual representation of the threats. And I've never seen this for software. It would be very interesting to do, but product managers don't know that. Product managers don't know that I can take 2 medium priority issues and exfiltrate data from your organization. HD Moore had mentioned it. I know some people we've published notes on the SecureSys website about the Heartland breach that we were given some inside information on. They went through the corporate network. 2 minor bugs, basically. They got in, installed malware on those. Somebody made a mistake and left open the gateway into the financial services area, and they exfiltrated data out. Rich Mogul does this great diagram. He calls it the data breach triangle. And he says for any data breach, you got to have three things. You got to have an exploit or a way to get in. You got to have something to steal, and you got to have a way to get it out. And if you break any one of those, you don't have the data breach. And I'm telling you, from the breach research that we're getting, from a lot of the attacks that we're seeing, it's never one. It's almost always a series of attacks to circumvent or compromise security and then get the information back out. So this is a problem with Agile. It's probably the biggest single problem I've seen. What can you do about it? You can train the PM. Most of you are going to have to find ways of getting stuff back out of the bucket. I've done some things like going into the bug database and just automatically upping the priority after 90 or 180 days on medium issues and high priority issues to get them actually to be critical issues. And this is in contrast to waterfall, because if you've ever seen the dynamic of a waterfall process, when you select the features that go into waterfall, you always take too many. You always pad it with a couple, and then the product manager at the very end goes, well, we don't have quite time to get these 2 or 3 features in, and they fall off the end. And it's always the ones that are questionable. It doesn't happen really with Agile to the same degree. But what it does mean is that the stuff never gets onto the queue. What you can also do is different onboarding techniques. So if you can do some sort of a risk-based analysis on these threats and be able to understand that if I have these 2 threats or these 3 different threats, if I mitigate any one of those 3, that it really helps. And so you escalate one of the 3 from a medium priority to a critical and get it fixed, and that way you break that triangle. I have run, personally, what I did is I just had one particular coder who was really good with secure code, and he developed my tools in my library that the other developers would use. And so that was his dedicated responsibility. So the product manager just simply fed him task cards that were related to security. So I at least always got some piece of security done over and above the other types of code development. So kind of wrapping up this, least qualified person in the team to make the security decisions. The just-in-time planning really doesn't work for a lot of security, threat analysis, and the other things we're trying to do. Security backlog, trying to move it back onto the pile, and keeping metrics. How many of the the metrics piece is pretty complicated because it's you've got to keep metrics for a couple of different areas of which pieces of the code are actually being addressed, which aren't. How many security issues are known and not getting addressed versus how many feature function issues are coming in. You want to keep tracking for individual developers on their code. And I'll get to a couple of examples of that in a little bit. Continuing on with the people part of this. Every organization I've ever worked for would much rather hire somebody right out of school because they're cheaper, they're more energetic, and that's probably enough motivation right there. Problem is that most of them have no freaking idea what they're doing for the first year that they're coding. Sure, they might know Java, they might know Ruby really well, but they don't understand the rest of the infrastructure, they don't understand the processes, they don't understand the bug tracking system and why it's important to keep it up to date, they don't understand all of the trouble ticketing systems, the testing systems, they don't understand how to write tests, they tend to skimp a little bit here and there. But as developers grow in experience, their understanding of the ecosystem that they live in day to day, it grows. And they understand why some of this stuff is important. They understand how the things that they do enables the other piece. If the designer makes the right choices, the right tool choices, it makes the developer's job easier. If the developers are actually doing their unit testing and write good and quality unit tests, it takes a lot of the burden off the quality assurance teams. So, one of the things, if you are a Scrum manager or a product manager, you've got to watch who gets trained, who gets assigned different tasks. From a security standpoint, this is really important because a newbie may not understand what exactly it is and why it's important for input validation and input filtering. They may not be able to make the choices that do I want to do input filtering at the application, or does it make more sense to implement that as a stored procedure which can help on the back end. There are a lot of choices to be made. Coders,